I guess if we're being honest, every one of us should have to pluck out an eye, right? You see, if you're reading along with us this week in Matthew chapter 5, verse 27 through 30, and you've ever lusted after someone, well, then you understand what I mean. You see, we live in a world where lust isn't just accepted, it's encouraged. But for Jesus, this wasn't so. You see, God equates sexuality with purity, especially within marriage. In Matthew chapter 5, verse 27 through 28, Jesus said these words, "You have heard that it was said, 'Do not commit adultery,' but I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart." It's pretty simple, right? Jesus does with adultery and lust what he did with murder and hate. You see, the Pharisees would say, "Oh, well, murder is wrong." Jesus said that's right, but also hate is wrong. And now they're saying, "Oh, well, adultery is wrong." And Jesus says, that's right, adultery is wrong, but it's also just as wrong to lust after someone. You see, the law provides the foundation for this disconnect for us. So many laws governing sexual purity in the Bible. It's not about being a prude. It's about keeping families healthy and relationships healthy. Jesus has eyes for one bride, and that's His church. And we should follow His example in our relationships, which is why divorce is an abomination. But let me be very clear from the start. Divorce and adultery are forgivable sins. Now, if you grew up in a fundamentalist church, especially in the South, then you may have seen divorcees shunned away from service in the church. And that's really sad, considering that God gave all Christians spiritual gifts for the good of the body. And if your sin doesn't equate to that sin, though, then sometimes we had a tendency to judge people, especially in those circles. But let me ask you this. If a couple is married in the eyes of God at their pronouncement, at the wedding, when do they become divorced in the eyes of God? Is it when the divorce papers are signed? Does God check the records at the Register of Deeds and the Clerk of Court offices and say, well, I guess they are signed and the papers look in order, so therefore they're divorced? No, it only makes sense that divorce finally occurs when one of the couple who is separated enters either into a marriage covenant with someone else and or enters a relationship sexually. If a person is still married in the eyes of God and they marry or enter a relationship with someone else, what is that called? It's called adultery. It was very easy in Jesus' day to get a divorce. A man could simply drag his wife to the elders of the town that they lived in and say, I divorce you 3 times, or give her a certificate of divorce, and that was it. She could have overcooked the bread that night, and he was just fed up with it, and now they're divorced. You see, that cheapens the relationship that God has with us. All divorce cheapens the relationship that God has with mankind. Because we're talking about covenants here. We're not talking about just simple promises. We're talking about covenants that last. But let me encourage you with this. No matter the circumstances of your divorce, there is forgiveness available. You see, Jesus was pointing out here in Matthew that divorce and adultery both caused great pain. Jewish men couldn't commit adultery. That was against the Mosaic and the Pharisaic law. But they could divorce at the drop of a hat. And then they could go run after someone else, often in the same day. They were getting around adultery by just divorcing. Again, there's a deeper morality here that's needed to be embraced and held on to, and it's called unconditional love. Deeper morality saves lives of families. Unconditional love of your spouse will save you from adultery and divorce. And unconditional love for someone of the opposite sex will honor them and respect them and not cheapen them to a sexual object. Instead, they're a creation, either a child of God or a future, hopefully, child of God. Divorce is forgivable, and so is adultery. And the path to avoiding both for all parties involved is the unconditional love of Christ. I don't know where you're at. I don't know what your relationship was like if you've gone through a divorce. But whatever it is, find the forgiveness that God offers for such things. Don't get caught up in the guilt and the shame that Satan so often puts upon people who have done something and they just think it's a stigma that has to last forever. Seek forgiveness from God because He does love unconditionally and He's provided a path through Jesus Christ. I love you just the way you are. God loves you a whole lot more.